Hello everyone, welcome to this video where I talk about the methods of reducing frictions. Uh, these methods are mainly to overcome the disadvantages that we get about the friction. So the methods of reducing friction between the surfaces include as follows. The first one is polishing. Polishing this is like reducing some kind of a paint to the surface of the material. So the polishing the surface reduces the roughness and hence reduces the friction. As when the surface of the material, if it is smooth, so the friction force is lower compared with the surface of the material if it is rough, so the friction force will be higher. Moving on, the second one is that lubrication. Uh, Lubrication, this is the imposing of the lubricants to a material. So it provides a layer of the smooth fluid or semi-fluid between the surfaces in contact so that they slide over each other smoothly. So if the surfaces of material, if they slide each other smoothly, so the frictional force is lower compared if the surface of material is rough, the frictional force will be high. So we're using the friction here by smoothing the surface in contact between these two objects. The third one is that use of ball bearings or rollers. The rollers help to convert the sliding friction into media form rolling friction, as the rolling friction is lesser than the sliding friction. This means that the rolling tends to be in the certain accord or certain arrangement. So this means that the surface in contact is made in a clear path, so it becomes smooth. So as if the surface becomes smooth, then the friction is lowered compared to the sliding friction where that there's a direct flow or the direct contact of the two bodies. Moving on, let's talk about the types of friction. There are three main types of friction in a daily life, which include as follows. The first one is the static friction. The static friction, this is an opposing force between the two solids objects that they are at rest. So in simply words, we can say that when there is no relative motion between the two solid objects in contact with each other, we describe the friction force between them as a static friction. So that's all about the static friction as the friction of the bodies in contact at rest. The second one is the limiting friction. The limiting friction is the maximum frictional force existing between the two bodies in contact. A force must be applied to overcome this limiting friction as to enable the bodies move over one another. So the limiting friction is the maximum amount of frictional force that is existing between the two bodies in contact. Now the numerical you can say that is equal to the minimum external force required to make a body just to move over to another. So that's what is the limiting friction. Now the limiting friction is independent of the applied force, but it depends on the nature of the surface. So it depends on the nature of the surface, whether it's smooth surface or rough surface. So that's what about it, the limiting friction. Moving on, the third one is the dynamic friction. Dynamic friction, this is the numerically equal to the force of opposition when a body is moving through the rough surface. So when the body is relatively in motion over the rough surface, we get the dynamic friction as it is the term they are dynamic. It means that the body is in motion or movement. So we get the dynamic friction. Moving on, let's talk about the laws of friction. So there are five laws which friction depends on. The first one is that the friction force depends on the normal reaction. The normal reaction reacts to the body. So the friction force is directly proportional and it is perpendicular to the normal reaction. So that's what is the first one. So the frictional force, the amount of frictional force will depend on the normal reaction that is exerted by the body in contact. The second one is that friction is independent of the area of contact. So the area of contact in that place, it won't determine the amount of friction. So it is, they are not corresponding, or they are not related to each other. So that's the second law which we have to notice. The third one is that the coefficient of static friction is slightly greater than the coefficient of kinetic friction. So the coefficient of static friction, this is the value of friction in rest, while the coefficient of kinetic friction is the value of friction to the body in motion. So we can simply say that the value of the static friction is slightly greater than the value of the kinetic friction. The fourth one is that the kinetic friction is independent of the velocity of the body. So this means that the value you get on the kinetic friction is it is mostly, it is far away from the velocity of the body. So it means that they are not corresponding, or they are not interrelating to each other. This means that the velocity of the body cannot contribute to the amount of kinetic friction, or the value you get from the kinetic friction cannot be due to the velocity of the body. The last one is that the friction depends on the nature of surface in contact. This we have already seen there, that the rough surface exert much friction compared to the smooth surface. So these are the main 5 laws of friction. I hope it's clear, guys. Thank you for listening.